talk to this public lecture. It's a pleasure for us to have such a crowded room here interested in Milton Friedman, which is quite a surprise, if I may say. Our institute is an independent research institution established, as you saw in the video, in collaboration with the University of Buckingham. Actually, our premises are in the campus of the University of Buckingham. We are an educational charity and we depend entirely on people's donations. So if you think that what we do is worthwhile, please don't hesitate to make a contribution. What we do is very traditional monetary analysis. But by being traditional, what I have discovered in the last 2 or 3 years is that we are very innovative, quite extraordinary, actually revolutionary in the last few years. And this is just because we pay attention to changes in monetary trends in major economies. By doing so, what we do is to assess how changes in the amount of money in circulation will be affecting prices, not just consumption prices, but also asset prices, equity, shares, real estate, and also the overall economy. And again, this is a very traditional approach to monetary economics, going back to the 16th and 17th centuries, to the so-called School of Salamanca. And, but again, not so many institutes, and indeed academics, or even less policymakers, are that interested in these patterns. We are much more, in my opinion, interested in finding out the very short-run explanations of inflation, again in the very short term. And in my opinion, we're missing the picture, the broader picture about the determinants of inflation. And this is something that I'm going to just end with. If there is a universal law in economics, certainly monetary economics, is that inflation and deflation are monetary phenomena over the long term, indeed. It may take some time, but in the end, an excess in the amount of money circulation over the rate of growth in the economy will be inflationary. Again, it can take some time, but it will be inflationary. This is what you can call the law of monetary physics. It does hold. And with this provocative statement, may I leave you with the chairman of the institute, Professor Tim Condon, and then afterwards there will be an introduction to the speaker. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's very nice to see such a big group of people. I'm Tim Condon. I'm the chairman and founder of the institute. This is the third lecture in our series. We're very lucky to have Dr. James Forder to give it. The previous two were in London, and we got quite a big crowd for that. But to get a crowd of this size in Oxford, I think is a tribute to James. There's obviously a lot of interest in James, and obviously we want to know what you'll say about Friedman. I suppose there's interest in Friedman too, and that also has come as a bit of a surprise, but anyway, there we are. I think that I will not sort of take too much longer on just introducing what we do. I think we've finally done a very good job. We're very lucky to have Dr. James Forder to talk to us this evening about Milton Friedman. There is a book coming out next year, and this is a very good advertisement for it, so I hope that you're also grateful to us for organising it. But we're very lucky to have you, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
I'm James Forder. I'm not a professor in this funny university. Don't use those titles in quite the way people expect. But in any case, I too am very pleased to see so many people here. It always amazes me when people are interested in my research topics. And find this many people interested in Milton Friedman is indeed a treat for me. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about Milton Friedman's influence. I got myself in a bit of a academic sticky situation thinking about having written this title, because oh dear, now what do I mean by influence? Yes. So we have to do some apologising for that. I'll tell you a bit about Friedman in a minute. Tell you a bit about influence first. I decided it's not at all an easy one. Certainly, there's a lot that Friedman wrote a huge amount during his life. And clearly that all flows into the stream of economic research, and a lot of it is very, very clever. A lot of it made lasting impacts in little corners of scholarship, that sort of thing. That's not exactly what I mean by his influence. Of course that's there. He's a very important economist. I was thinking about other things. There's a way in which he might or might not be setting the agenda of research. His ideas seize the minds of other economists. There's a question about the lasting impact of specific proposals that he made. We certainly find temporary impacts, lasting impacts, a bit of a harder one. And there's a question of whether, when things go his way, to what extent we want to say he's a distinct cause of them. Because there are some cases where certainly things went his way. Well, I've got to question whether, or how much that's really due to him. Anyway, and this is the point, substantial point from the book, sounds a funny thing to say, but somebody's influence is not discovered by reading what came after them. Contrary to my academic colleagues who think you find out what Friedman's influence was by reading things about what he wrote, after what he wrote, and observing particularly how many times particular bits of writing by him are cited, and whether the later authors keep declaring it to be brilliant. And if they do that, and especially if it's in the textbooks, then that's his influence. What I've noticed is there's another way of doing it. If you look at what was written before he wrote, that's the only way of finding out which bits of what he said are original. And there are a few cases where he's got credit for originality that he simply doesn't deserve. And he's said to be influential in certain areas when, at the time he wrote, everybody knew it. There was nothing new in it. It seems to be quite wrong to say that's influence. It's merely that slightly later authors have identified Friedman as the source of their information and, as it were, believe themselves influenced by him, but in fact it was a much longer standing idea. So we'll come to some specifics on that. He was born in 1912, died in 2006. He wrote a lot. These are mainly books he wrote, and mainly books which feature somewhere in what I'm going to say, if only briefly. Friedman and Kuznets was his first book, hardly read at all, not surprisingly. It's enormous and mostly not exciting, and became less exciting than the original draft, which got him in a lot of trouble for saying that the American Medical Association rigged the market for doctors in America, thereby raising their price. He didn't actually say rigged, if you're wondering, but he pretty clearly accused the AMA of restricting entry to the medical profession, certainly with the effect that the price of medical care in America was raised, and protested about this. Friedman and Stigler is a very short one, very readable one, a clever little book about the damage done by rent control. A clever book. Friedman and Stigler asserted, they didn't have a whole lot of data, but they made the best of what they had, asserted that after the San Francisco earthquake there'd been no housing shortage, although a huge number of buildings were knocked over, because the free market was allowed to operate. But in the post-war world with rent control, there was continuous housing shortage. A very clever argument. Restatement of the quantity theory of money. That's not a book, but I've got more to say about that. That's represented as Friedman's first go at stating his case. His case, a bit like what I was describing, that precisely the point that over long periods the quantity of money determines the price level, more or less. That's very much a Friedman view. There's beginnings of it in 1956, and much more fully in 1963, further down, Friedman and Schwartz. That's another gigantic book. It's 800 pages of very close study of the quantity of money in the United States. It's amazing how much you can write about that subject if you try. And its relation to nominal income measured in dollars, and hence to the price level. Those two, and so that the first one's theory, and the second one is data, a whole lot of data, and a fantastically impressive work consequently. I missed out too. A theory of the consumption function is about something entirely different. It's about household consumption and the right way to theorise that, about which more later. Capitalism and Freedom is a little book about, on the face of it, what he says it's about is how the capitalist system and political freedom are tied. You don't really observe one without the other much. And there were good reasons for this, says Friedman, quickly out of his depth in historical or political analysis. Tries to make that case that there's good reasons for it, but the rest of the book then there's a whole collection of very clever ideas about how the free market and the price mechanism work if you let them. It's just packed with these ideas. And it's rhetorical and argumentative, and he pushes his luck. But it's not a fully academic work, it slightly is a polemical work. And strongly recommended, a terrific read on getting ideas about how the price system works. So, Presidential Address to the American Economic Association is, I think, probably the second most overrated article in economics. And I'll tell you more about that. That's one of these things about how do you decide what the influence is. I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. He wrote 300 articles in Newsweek. He became an enormously controversial character, and in Britain, particularly, much despised. He was associated with Thatcher, which didn't do him any good. He was associated with a lot of foolish remarks about Britain, and he got a reputation for being a right-winger, being unsympathetic and illogical, really. The Guardian newspaper distinguished itself on one occasion by actually calling him, it's actually in the Guardian, they called him a cantankerous old bigot. And needless to say, that attracted a lot of letters from Guardian readers saying they'd fallen below their usual editorial standards, etc., etc. But anyway, cantankerous old bigot, Milton Friedman, it said. But people in Britain didn't read Newsweek much. I think this is an important thing about it. He wrote 300 odd Newsweek articles in those years, 750 words or 1,000 words or 1,500 words, about whatever flew into his head, nearly always about economics, sometimes about bits of American politics, and of course there's so many they're variable, but some of them again are very clever commentaries on economic events in America, and very sympathetic ones, and all the time about how some market intervention is having the opposite of its intended effect. Its intended effect often being to help poor people, and he's got a story about why it's having the opposite of its intended effect. And if you read those, he comes across entirely differently from the Milton Friedman note of the Guardian. So I suspect that the British and the American view of him is, even at this distance, framed by the different experiences we've had of what to read. Theoretical framework for monetary analysis, that pops in briefly. That's another theoretical attempt at getting his point across about money. Won the Nobel Prize in 1976. Notice that's the year of his retirement. That's when he became famous in Britain that year as well. He was already retired. All his important work had been written before we noticed him over here. And Free to Choose is a rerun of Capitalism and Freedom. It's better written and with a few extra ideas, but the same sort of general line. So that's an outline of him. Now let's start to talk about his influence. Here's a commonplace idea about it. And the idea is put in different ways, and these points are all connected, but You know, they're partly distinct. Some of them are different ways of making the same point, or partly so. So one of them is that a monetary history of the United States, that's the Friedman and Schwartz 800-page effort, had a specific argument. In the big picture, the argument that the quantity of money is determinative of nominal income and hence the price level. In a particular instance, an important argument that monetary policy lay behind the Great Depression. That's crucial because received opinion at the time was that it didn't. Great Depression was caused by a collapse of the private sector, and monetary policy had been shown to be incapable of doing anything about it. This certainly is an aspect of Keynesian economics. So they look to the Keynesians as if they've got this great example of the failure of the private sector, the failure of the market system, and the failure of monetary policy to solve the problem. So that comes through in 100 pages of the book. And it's also said that this book re-established interest in monetary theory. Supposedly, economists had lost interest in studying monetary matters, and this got them back on it. Well, we'll see. Another common view, connected but distinct, concerns the question of the Keynesians and monetarism. And Friedman is called a monetarist. He's the leader of that movement. And so the story will say that Friedman shot down Keynesianism in monetary history and in other ways. Well, not so sure about that either, actually. The question of the control of inflation. Now, did you notice, while I almost said this, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's a Friedman catchphrase. He said that in 1963, and it caught on, he kept on saying it. So one of them was, is it true? Well, you've had one opinion earlier on. Whether that's true and the extent to which people are convinced that it is true is supposedly Friedman influence. Dismissing the Phillips curve, I'll tell you what the Phillips curve is later on. And, you know, Thatcherism generally supported, certainly he was a supporter of Thatcher and Reagan. People say he was closely influential. Well, he might have had some influence on Reagan. He didn't have any on Thatcher, despite what they all said. Close, personal, direct influence on her. None at all, as far as I can see. He met her 3 times, once before she was Prime Minister, once while she was Prime Minister when she left the room within a matter of minutes, and once long after she was Prime Minister. That doesn't sound too good. Anyway, A Monetary History of the United States. It's certainly a great book, and certainly one can find lots of things in the economics literature which flow from it. Well, that's not exactly influence. Its importance, if you like, scholarly importance of it is readily detectable. Not exactly influence in the way I was thinking of it. Associated arguments, it started a lot of particular arguments, and it seems to me that mostly they petered out. People stopped arguing about them, argued about them for a bit, and everybody said the other people were wrong. And then they stopped arguing about them, and they didn't really get resolved. They just lie there. Anyone goes back into the old books, you find these arguments are there, and each side's convinced they're right. And there's also led to some controversies that didn't end that way, that carry on. Well, the controversy carries on, you know, that's not his influence. The revival of monetary theory is a funny one. That story that it was monetary history that got everyone back to being interested in monetary theory. It's a characteristic of Friedman that he wrote a number of little histories of monetary theory since 1936, the year of Keynes' important book. And they all say pretty much the same thing. They say Keynes didn't think monetary policy was important, and interest was lost and started to be revived when the quantity theory was reformulated, etc. So they all say these kinds of things. And I believe, partly from personal experience, that everyone believes these stories. Because same story again and again. Well, I happened to notice while I was reading these old books that it's not right. The disappearance of interest in money is a myth. And it looks to me as if it's a myth created by Friedman's writings about it. So Friedman rather wrote everybody else out of history and himself into it by saying, well, nobody was interested in money until I wrote my book. And then suddenly everybody was interested in it again. It just isn't right. So there's, in 1948, so very early on, there was concern about inflation in America. And one of the leading economists put together a panel of 10 economists. It's published. It's called 10 Economists on the Inflation. And they asked, what do you think causes inflation? 4 of them gave prominence to money in explaining inflation in exactly the Friedman way. And a 5th one said, I don't think there's any doubt that we will all agree that the principal reason prices have gone up so much is an increase in the quantity of money. Well, there you are. This is the point that Friedman says, well, no one was making, but yet 5 out of 10 of them did. So his influence is not in reviving the study of money. So it didn't get far there. Monetarism, Keynesianism, part 1. Well, the restatement of the quantity theory, the theoretical statement that supposedly kicks this off, is expressed in very Keynesian terms. What it actually does is say there's an old quantity theory, an old story about how the quantity of money is related to the price level. It's ossified, I don't remember the word he uses, but there's a new story, and he tells you there's a new story, much more sophisticated story. Adding to the old story are a string of ideas to be found in Keynes. He doesn't say they're to be found in Keynes, but they are. And he clearly knew that, and other people pointed it out, and he very readily admitted it. And he said, well, the quantity theory was reformulated with Keynesian ideas. Well, you know, fine. That's no harm in reformulating theory that way, but it's a funny way of starting off a debate between the monetarists and the Keynesians, which is what it's later been said to do. Don't really get that. Don't think it could have done that. And it doesn't even look to me as if Friedman had it in mind to be particularly much against the Keynesians at that point. Slightly more so later, what he said actually was that this is Friedman of this period, Friedman late 1950s. What he says about Keynesianism is not that it's wrong, which is what he'd say later, but that it's not very useful. He says, look here, we need simple models to understand what's going on. Take note that he's in a period lacking computer power. Hadn't even occurred to him. I shouldn't think there could be that much computing power. We need simple models. The quantity theory is a simple model. If you organise your thinking around the idea that the quantity of money is a crucial determinant of economic activity, you'll find things neatly fall into place. And we've got the sophisticated version of quantity theory, and we can tell a story, we can predict pretty well with it. Or you've got the Keynesian theory, which in his characterization puts household consumption in the central position, so everything else is driven by household consumption in one way or another. And he says, well, come on, let's run these two against each other in various ways. Let's test them and see which one does better. And he had 3 attempts at making the point in that way. Different approach each time trying to engage his opponents, the Keynesians, with the argument, each time getting responses that said, the conclusions tend to say, no, you're wrong. What the substance said was, you haven't really proven your point. That he would make his point, and it would be less than wholly satisfactory, because he couldn't make it wholly satisfactory, and didn't say he was really. He was saying, look, the indications are that the quantity theory does better. And they'd come back at 3 times on different ways. So that 3 times, it's Friedman making the run-in. Friedman says, look, here's a way of addressing the question of which of these theories is better. Here's my go at it. Here's my treatment of the matter. It looks to me as if the quantity theory delivers better forecasts, better understanding generally. 3 times they picked holes in one way or another, certainly scored some points. From Friedman's point of view, they're all stalemates, really. He failed to gain anything. You've got to sympathise with him, though, because he is the one making the run-in. He's the one trying to get the point resolved, but not really managing to do it. So this is what I mean by arguments that just peter out. Sometimes there's a whole issue of a journal that's devoted to arguing Friedman versus opponents on one or other of these, and everybody disagrees, and then it stops. And sure enough, you can find people today still telling you that one side or the other was absolutely right about it, but, you know, you can find individuals saying all kinds of things. So, what about the control of inflation? Monetarism and the control of inflation. Now, this comes a bit later. People have the idea inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. People have the idea that that sort of thought is pushed by Friedman as an explanation of inflation, as implying a cure for inflation, control the money supply. From a very early stage, well, really it's not. He says it in 63, but not in that sense of offering a cure. And there isn't enough inflation in the earlier period for that sort of thing to come to the fore, really. So when inflation takes off in the 70s and the 80s, and that Friedman starts to put the case, what you need to do now is control the money supply, and that will stop the inflation. Puts that case squarely. Now, what's the basis for that? Well, you might say that's what Friedman and Schwartz show, but it isn't. Because what Friedman and Schwartz show is that over very long periods, the price level and the quantity of money are closely related. They don't say, if you reduce the growth in the money supply in 1974, you'll see the effects on inflation in 75 and 76. And it's predictable, percentage point for percentage point. They don't say anything like that. Nowhere near. So if that's the policy that was being advocated or adopted, you don't get it from Friedman and Schwartz. Friedman in Newsweek, well, that's a bit better, because actually Friedman in Newsweek does tell this sort of story. All the time he's saying, over the last 6 months, the quantity of money, as always in America, has grown at this rate. I predict inflation will rise next year. It's slightly variable, whether it's 3 months or 9 months, this sort of thing. He does say that, and he does a bit of squirming when the forecasts turn out to be wrong, and a little catalogue of excuses that he makes about special circumstances. Sometimes they turn out to be right, of course. So that's all right. That's Friedman, if you like, but it's not properly speaking the outcome of his research. It's what he says when he's commenting on policy. So, when the Conservative government, the Thatcher government, took up money supply targeting, there's a certain amount of publicity of that, which did seem to say we're going to control the money supply now, and that will control inflation very soon. That's politics, of course. And it does look a bit like Friedman in Newsweek, but it doesn't look like any serious research by Friedman, because over short periods of time there's too much variability. Friedman himself perfectly clearly says over short periods of time all sorts of things cause the price level to change, and that gets measured as inflation in that year. So there's a way in which you could say that policy was derived from Friedman, it's Friedman's influence, but you're looking at Friedman's journalism when you do. That seems a funny place to go. A bit of a political excuse, actually, I think, monetary targeting. Not to say it can't be rationalised, but in fact, the problem was that governments all around the world, notably in Britain, but in lots of other places, had come to the conclusion that they could reduce inflation only by means that would have the effect of raising unemployment. And that was unwelcome and had previously been denied, had previously been said it was possible to control inflation without raising unemployment, and that had been tried, and it hadn't apparently worked. So there's a bit of useful science about it. We're not going to reduce inflation by raising unemployment. We're going to reduce inflation by this scientific business of controlling the money supply, and then unemployment does indeed rise, which was probably inevitable. But it's got that aspect of political excuse. Anyway, monetary targeting didn't last. In 1981, 1982, 1980, we were being told the percentage rates of increase of various measures of the money supply that the government said it was going to achieve. That was monetary targeting. If you said, Friedman has said that you should achieve a stable rate of growth of the supply of money, and that's what we're heading towards. It wasn't ever going to be stable because it had to be reduced, but starting from inflationary circumstances, that's where we're heading. There'd be a case, say, of focusing specifically on the money supply as a Friedman idea. It lasted much less than a decade. So that's not exactly his influence. The point of inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, as originally used, by the way, is an interesting one, because it wasn't a general advert for monetarism. It came up specifically in the context of something else being said to be the cause of inflation. The first time, actually, it was economic development. Friedman was speaking in India, where it was being said that a degree of inflation was more or less an inevitable consequence of rapid economic growth. And exactly why that should be is, well, various ways one might rationalise that, but that's what was being said about it. And it was Friedman's rebuttal. No, you can have just as much growth with price stability. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning not a growth phenomenon. The second time he used it, 66, arguing about incomes policy. So the plan was that inflation could be controlled or something by agreement with wage bargainers. The government could persuade the wage bargainers that the wage increases would be kept down. And this would, one way or another, contribute to the control of inflation. It was tried a great deal in Britain and the United States, lots of other places. Seems to have worked quite badly. And this was Friedman rejecting that. Wage increases are not the cause of inflation. Controlling wages won't stop inflation, therefore. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, means you're not going to get anywhere with wage control. That's what it meant the second time he used it. So, always and everywhere, it's neither development nor is it wages. Okay. In those contexts, it's certainly not a unique insight. There was a great debate about incomes policy, but Friedman was a long way from being the only person who thought they wouldn't work. And to call the alternative monetary isn't exactly on point. Friedman's case, actually, was that inflation was caused by excess demand. That was the alternative view to the incomes policy view. Inflation is always and everywhere an excess demand phenomenon. Would have served the purpose just as well. And lots of people would have agreed with that. And there's no, in context, there's no true focus on excess demand arising from monetary policy. Friedman may well also have believed that, but, well, he did believe that. But that wasn't quite the point of what he was saying. So there's an importance there which will show up again later, but the inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon tagline is not as much a monetarist line in its origin as it seems, and it would in fact gather support from a lot of people who aren't monetarists. So, I don't, there's a bit of influence there if you like, but not all that much. This is the Phillips curve. Monetarism versus Keynesianism too. That actually is the curve of Phillips. I just copied it out of Phillips' paper from 1958. A few things to notice. The bottom line tells you the data period, 1861 to 1913. A funny looking data period for a paper published in 1958, but there you are. The circles, the black blobs, are of course the data points, and it says wages went up by this much in some year and unemployment was that much. And the line, the curving line, is the curve as it was drawn by Phillips. You might wonder whether that curve really is a summary of those points. And it was a sort of hump in the middle that causes some people doubt about it. But anyway, Phillips is a jolly clever man, and he made that curve be the summary of those points. So that's the actual Phillips curve. As it was treated later, there's a bit more to be said. It's a rather crowded slide. According to myth or fantasy, this is definitely not correct. Supposedly, Phillips' paper led to inflationist policy. Supposedly, somebody said, Phillips' relationship, such a good one, if we raise inflation, that will lower unemployment, is supposedly the lesson drawn from Phillips. It's not even a curve about inflation, it's a curve about wage rates. But, there you go. If we raise, so there's a story out there that inflation is potentially desirable because it lowers unemployment. And so the story continues. Friedman, that's the presidential address that I said was the second most overrated paper in economics, said this won't work because if you run an inflation policy, in the long term, people will notice their expectations of inflation will adjust to this reality. That will affect the wage bargaining. Now the wage bargaining has got inflation embedded in it, and that Phillips relationship will change so that you'll get just inflation and no benefit in unemployment. That is, of course, a very sensible argument. I'm not criticising the theory of that argument. I'm just commenting that the story that has Friedman responding in this way to an environment in which policy was being set to reduce unemployment by means of inflation is historically not correct. It's not a theoretical point. And supposedly there was a big argument about this which Friedman won. Well, no. No one said any of those things. And no one said anything they're supposed to. Everyone, no one thought the Phillips curve suggested inflationist policy, hardly anyone. You find 2 or 3. Everyone knew about the expectations argument. Inflationist policy based on the Phillips curve is entirely invisible. Policymaker acceptance of inflation based on the Phillips curve is entirely undetectable. It's a good little trivia question, actually. Who was the first political leader of a major country to accept inflation? You can think about that and tell me at the end. First one, actually say, we've got inflation, that's fine. Never mind, we've got inflation and that's a good thing. If you want to know more, and in particular, if I've so provoked you by these outrageous claims that you insist on seeing the evidence, then it's in my book, Macroeconomics and the Phillips curve myth. And I'll just carry on. Some people stubbornly refuse to be persuaded by the evidence in that book, so I've got a bit more concerning Friedman's presidential address. This is, you can find hundreds, literally hundreds of assertions, indeed, you know, they're in textbooks, that this is the paper where Friedman nailed the Keynesians. The Keynesians had this Phillips curve. Friedman said that's wrong in 1968, and the thing fell apart. Well, no, because the expectations argument is all over the earlier literature, easy to find. I can show you 30 or 40 cases. But here's another point. No one in Friedman's work, if you just read what Friedman says about the 1968 paper, you get a very striking picture. Because there is, as far as I can see, nowhere in the first 7 years, so he's writing tens of items per year. They're not all about inflation, of course, but some of them are. So there's must be 100 things he's written in 7 years. Never once does he say, back in 1968, I made a key argument. He never says, those Keynesians had it wrong, and I put them straight in my 1968 presentation. For 7 years. Now, he's quite a publicist, as a self-publicist. You may sort of guess, free to choose, 300 Newsweek articles, Capitalism and Freedom. You don't write these things unless you're interested in getting your name in the newspapers. And here he is, he's destroyed Keynesianism, supposedly, in 1968, never mentions it for 7 years. I don't think so. He knew perfectly well that he hadn't destroyed Keynesianism. In 1975, he does start to say it. There we can see, if you think, well, perhaps he was being shy, you know, for 7 years. Well, he stopped being shy very suddenly in 1975 then, where thereafter, all the time, it's these Keynesians had it wrong and I pointed it out. And the crucial thing is, of course, that by 1975, other people had started saying that. Other people who had read Friedman 1968 and not been aware of the earlier literature. They started to identify Friedman as the source of this idea, and Friedman picked it up. And now, I'm not kidding, go read the textbooks. Everybody says Friedman was the one who did this. Extraordinary. It's also a very badly written paper, which no one's ever noticed. It's full of mistakes. Friedman had so many people after him that it would certainly have, they'd certainly have had a laugh anyway. There's no influence there, no true influence, if you look back at what was known before. So, what remains? The textbooks say Friedman changed everything by shooting down the Phillips curve. That's wrong. It is true that monetary policy rather than fiscal policy has become central in policy making. And that's noticeable in Britain more than the United States. It is true that incomes policy has disappeared. That's a Friedman view, but lots of other people's view. Here's a thought, though. Look at the specific battles he fought. Look at details. He was against central bank independence. Do we see his influence there? He was in favour of rules, meaning automaticity, automatic responses of policy. Certainly don't see influence there, because otherwise, why are we pointing all these tremendous economists, some of whom are here, to make decisions about monetary policy for us, if it's being made automatic? Use all that brain power on something else, wouldn't we? We would, of course we would. He was in favour of targeting the money supply, and specifically against targeting the price level. And he was for keeping your eye on money, not interest rates. Where's the influence? Let me shoot on. I'm being told I'm going on too long. Here's an influence, and it's hard to see because he's been so influential. Something Friedman does from the beginning, from the criticism of the American Medical Association in Friedman and Kuznets, on rent control. In a dissent, he wrote a piece with 4 other people in 1950, meant to be different views. He only disagreed with them on one thing. It was price control. Incomes policy is price control. Capitalism and freedom's full of it. Corporate social responsibility, which is one of his famous things, in its original form, was about price control. He's all the way through in favour of the market system, not quite in favour of the free market system, because negative income tax was his idea for give poor people negative income tax and take away all the other benefits, was his idea, a simple solution. And education vouchers, give parents vouchers to send their children to school and let them pick the school. And the schools can compete for, and the parents can add money to it. That's being in favour of the price mechanism, not being in favour of the free market, because the government's there subsidising the schools. And today, this is all over the place. What's called neoclassical economics, when I'm teaching it to undergraduates, is always about how prices are set or how they determine things, or whatever it is. And Friedman is very much the loudest voice. And the crucial thing about it is, and I can stop, the crucial thing about it is how different that is. The theory of wage bargaining, for example, was all about psychology and sociology and the real economics. You go to the economics journals and find out what do people say about how wages are set. And it isn't about marginal product of labour. It's about being fair to the unions. It's about managerial objectives. It's about alternative strategies different firms have. It's not price theory as any of us would recognise it. The managerial, the price setting, same sort of thing, goods price setting, and the managerial, the matter of whether firms maximise profit and what the objectives of management are, that sort of thing. There's an extreme aversion to interest rate variability through the period. Friedman says, well, come off it. Interest rates go up, that'll affect lending. There's credit allocation, quantitative allocation. That's pretty well gone. Exchange rates, well, floating exchange rates he was in favour of. That's mainly been adopted. There's a small variation, the theory of consumption. That's the book that I was talking about earlier. And just say a little bit about it. It's a tremendous book for providing simple theory that does a great job of explaining. Look, I can't resist it. I'm going to show you one more. Let's have a quick read of that. Ruth Mack, 1952. Ruth Mack was a very serious scholar of household consumption, and certainly an economist. And look at what she says you have to know about consumption. Everything that influences what a person is and how he got that way, etc., etc., etc. Friedman comes along, simple theory, this will do it, and then he makes it work, produces a mass of evidence that fits that. And that psychologist's view disappeared for half a century, really. You might say it's coming back. But this is a real Friedman legacy, because he is the loudest and most persistent advocate of the view that these market mechanisms and simple theory based on market mechanisms work very well in describing. The theory works very well in describing what's happening, and the mechanisms work very well in delivering the things that people want. And it's hard to see because it's so routine. This is economics the way we do it. And it doesn't even occur to people that there might be a time when it wasn't that way, or much less an individual who's clearly the leader of the movement going there. So there you are, that's reassessing Friedman's influence. The literature's got it wrong, giving him too much influence in the monetary area and not enough in the price theory area.